So today, I want to bring you my top 3 tips that I learned in the last month or so. Tip number 1 is to get a sensitivity writer. I've heard sensitivity writers under different names. Now what happened was I attended a writing convention called the Renaissance Convention, and at that convention they had a lot of people speaking who are like panelists who had different disabilities, whether it was physical, emotional, whether they were gay, and these people were talking about the different kinds of tropes and how those tropes can be harmful or not exist in a lot of Caucasian writers' books, and how those things are very underrepresented. And it really had me thinking about my own work, because it's true, my heroes are often Caucasian, whether male or female. They don't necessarily have an underlying mental disorder. They're often, just kind of your everyday Caucasian person. So it's actually interesting to hear them talk about that. What would happen if your hero was in a wheelchair, but those people can still do heroic things. They're not disabled. And they also talked about how there are those characters in books, but sometimes they're almost used as plot devices that the hero needs to save them. Or that, even worse, at the end of a book, like this disability or thing they're cured of, as if there's such a thing as to be cured of, and thank the hero for the cure. And those kinds of harmful tropes can be damaging to trying to represent those people. So that really made me think about all that, in my own writing. What am I doing to represent those people, and am I representing them correctly? And one of the things, because I'm not, I am just a Caucasian male, so one of the things that I have to think about is whether or not, if I'm representing them well, who can help me identify whether or not I'm doing an okay representation. And that's where a sensitivity writer comes in. So if you have, and your sensitivity writer would chances are be within that spectrum that you're working with, because you can't just have someone who thinks, like I do, by doing some research, that I know what it feels like to be that person, or what it looks like in my book to be that person. So you need someone who actually lives it and breathes it every day, and knows what it feels like, and how your story would impact them based on whatever it is that they're feeling. So a sensitivity writer, to hire one, to have one as a beta reader, I think is a really good idea. I haven't jumped on that yet. My book 1, in the story, I touched on a few things, and I plan to get a sensitivity writer at some point, but we'll see what happens. So, quick interlude, an update on where I am at with my writing, is that I just started book number 2. So I finished my 3rd and 4th draft of book 1, and I sent it off to a beta reader. And I'm now in book 2. I just started it, which is nice. It's nice and fresh. I feel like the characters they're not new, but it's like I'm discovering who they are again as I move forward. What's happening as I discover it. Well, with the reader, as I mentioned before, I'm probably a bit more of a discovery writer than an outliner. I do have an idea of where I want to go with the story, but I just find my characters do whatever the hell they want to do, whether I like it or not. Even if I've thought about it a lot, once I really get into those characters, I find it really hard to stay on track, and they just do what they want to do. So discovery writing works for me. It makes for more, it makes for more work in the further drafts, but we'll see what happens. I have done more work on the outline, which is something I mentioned in a previous podcast episode, that I wanted to take more time to do more outlining and to work on that, which I am. I'm using Scrivener. I find the corkboard option, where I can have a corkboard at the top of my screen. If you know Scrivener, you may or may not know what I'm talking about right now. But corkboard at the top of the screen, I have what version of this scene I'm on, or chapter I'm on. What I need to do in the rewrite, if anything. What is the synopsis for this area of piece of writing that I'm doing. So I find that's been really helpful in the outlining process. Thinking, of course, being key. Often when I go for a run with my dog, I'm listening to a podcast, or I'm listening to a story, and now I'm running without headphones and without listening to anything, because I'm trying to focus a little bit more on what I'm writing and where my characters are going. And if I introduce this in book one, where do I need it to go in book two? If anywhere, did I introduce it well in book one? The nice thing about not having published book one officially yet is that it's with my beta reader, and I can make adjustments to it before, as book two starts to evolve and then becomes book three in the trilogy. I actually called it Armageddon's Descendants for now. We'll see if that title sticks or not. So, number two thing that I learned is to let it go. Not just a popular Disney song, but also for writers, at some point you have to let your book go. I may have touched on this in a previous episode, but even more so right now, as I wrote draft 3 and draft 4, I was going to send it to a beta reader sooner, and I talked about it, and then it's like every draft I did is like I needed another draft. Like it just didn't, is it ready for that beta reader yet? Is it the best thing I can do? And what happened is in draft number 3, I went through the whole story again, and then I realized I needed another draft to kind of make stronger verbs, so that my story sounded stronger, to remove the ing words, to take out all the thans. So a lot of the coulds, just words that didn't necessarily need to be in there or could be worded better, I needed to take those out. So I did a draft like that, which took a couple of weeks to get through the whole, which was draft 4. It took a couple of weeks to get through all that. And I finally finished that, and then I get to draft, and I'm thinking, damn, I need to write draft number 5, because a lot of those words that I changed to try and make stronger may have somewhat changed the meaning of the scene without me realizing it, because I changed so many of them. Turning walked into, jogged or sauntered or skipped, or, whatever stronger, more meaningful verb you could have used. That changed the meaning in some cases, and because I did it so many times, it could be really tough to whether or not I made a mistake somewhere, because when you're changing that many words in a draft, sometimes you don't realize leading up to that sentence what you actually meant to say, and then suddenly that meaning is changed because of a word choice change. So even though that sentence in itself sounded totally fine, when you wrote it, it got when you changed the word, you didn't have paragraphs of reading up to that word to see if it was the right change for you. So going through that, I thought, oh crap, I should probably do number 5. And then I thought, you know what, I can't be writing book 1 forever. And what's going to happen is a beta reader is going to come along, and they're going to say, oh, none of this was working. You need to change this, which very well could happen. This plot fork in the road is not working for me. It doesn't. If my beta reader thinks it sucks, and now a few beta readers think it sucks, then I know maybe it does suck, and then I have to change everything anyway. So let it go. That would be something I learned. I just had to let it go and move it on. I finally did, which is why I started book number 2, and it feels good to be on book number 2. But just keep that in mind. At some point, we all just have to move on to our beta readers. One interesting thing, though, is that in draft 2 that I'm working on right now, all that work I did is obviously, every book makes you a stronger writer. That's what you're looking for. But I've already found that writing book 2, using Scrivener, using some of the things I've already learned and redrafting so many times in book 1, I've already avoided a lot of the mistakes and pitfalls that I made in book 1. So I'm already noticing, oh, I just said walked. I got to do something better than that, and then I'll reword that. I also noticing when I start writing for the day, I'm going back to what I wrote the day before to quickly read that, just to get, not only to get my mindset in the right frame, but to just kind of double check or look over how that was worded. So it's almost like doing a second draft while writing the first draft, because I'm kind of browsing what I did before. Some people say that's a bad idea, and they don't. They want to just plow through, get the job done. I'm not really worried about whether or not I'm going to get book 2 done. I know I will, because I'm still excited. I want to write this project. I don't know. If I slow down, I guess I'll talk in another episode if that went horribly wrong. But I think it'll work for me to do that, backtrack a little bit, read through, then start writing again for the day. That's just something I think that works for me. Tip number 3. read a lot. I know it goes without saying. Every writer knows that, and every writer hopefully is a big reader. It's kind of part of it's part of what we signed on for. But when you read, there's a difference between reading. I've looked at videos on speed reading to think, oh, how can I read more books faster? Because I have so many books that I want to read. And then I realized, well, if I read that fast, because when you look at techniques for reading faster, you realize that you're probably missing a lot of the story in the processing, like in your mind's processing. I remember Terry Goodkind got like flogged for his comment about read my book slower, because you need to appreciate it. You don't appreciate it if you read it too fast. And man, did he get hammered for that. But I understand where he's coming from, because when I read a book too fast, I miss those things. Maybe you don't, I do. That's my perspective. So I read to learn, not only to understand the story, but to learn from the story. So I want to know, especially now that I'm writing a lot more, why did that work? Why was he able to do that? So I'm just going to bring up a couple of books really quickly before I run out of time, to be under 15 minutes, because I know we both got to get back to writing. Some books and some of the things I learned. So Justin Hyde, he is a self-published author. He wrote the book Dead Man's Tale. And in this book, what I learned about it is that he did a lot of research. It was actually quite well done. When I read through it, I believed what he was saying about the places because of the way he described the architecture, because of the way he described the country. He also had, religion, because that was kind of part of the whole Dead Man's Tale, and I'm not going to spoil the story for you, but religion played a heavy role. But you could tell he did his research on, where Jesus supposedly died and on what day, and he played with that a bit, but that's fiction. That's what you're allowed to do that when you're writing fiction. And I really liked how that all worked out. One thing I learned that I didn't like as much was or I shouldn't say didn't like, but it caught me off guard a few times, was the omniscient point of view, where he kind of jumped heads. And I find that although John Grisham does it too, I find if you're not careful, that head jumping gets really confusing. And when you're the writer and you've written that scene a bunch of times, it seems perfectly clear what you're doing. But as a reader, sometimes you're just like, whoa, like, where am I now? Whose head am I in? Who is this person? What's going on? And that happened a couple times in the book, but otherwise it was still a really good book. I highly recommend the read. Zero Sum Game by S.L. Huang. This is about a girl who does math really, really quickly as a superpower. And I learned that, when writers talk about, hey, use what you've learned in your life, or do what write what you know. In that case, it worked out really well. She has a big background, university level mathematics, so she can really make that come to life because she knows math. If I tried to make her story as cool as it was using math, it would probably sound horrible, or I would have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out math in order to write that. So it's very unique to her and her character, because how many writers have that math background in order to make that world come to life? So, write what you know is some people know a lot of things. Everybody's experienced stuff. So you almost have to stop and think, what have I experienced in my life? And what from that can I bring into my writing? I have a military background. So what can I do from a military background point of view to bring my story more to life? And I actually have done that in book one. Unknowingly, one of my characters, if you remember, there are three main character point of views in the story: the son, the father, the grandfather. And the grandfather is actually a war vet. And I use that. He does a lot of, even in the verbs, he marches places. He sees, instead of just tall trees, he sees like soldiers and rank and file and these things that only a soldier would think of. It works well for the post-apocalyptic kind of fantasy that I'm writing, because it brings it more to life, because I've been, I've served enough time. I've laid in the grass and fallen asleep. I've, slept everywhere. I've slept through gunfire. I've slept through, all these things that I have that experience to draw upon for my book, and I actually did coincidentally. And last, John Grisham's Camino Winds. There's a part in that book, if you read it, where the characters are having a conversation. They're at a dinner, and one character, he builds certain dialogue into characters where you no longer have to use dialogue tags because of what this person says. So many has spoken in such a way that you know who it is that's speaking. And I think that's a great thing because it's really tough to do as a writer, unless without like putting like, you know, without giving them slang, not slang, but without, you know, giving them a different dialect or a different, completely different way of speaking. If it's just in this case, what he did was he said, oh, I'll use a different name as an example, but he said like, oh, come now, Jacob. And then this character said that like 3 or 4 times during an intense conversation. Oh, come now, Jacob. Oh, come on now, Jacob. You know, as just as part of that conversation. When it came up later in the book and you saw that dialogue take, oh, come on now, you knew exactly who was speaking. And I thought that was, that's really cool that you can actually almost foreshadow what you want to do later just through dialogue and through character development. And it was a minor character. It wasn't a big thing. And maybe a lot of people wouldn't have caught that, but it caught my eye because I thought that's really cool. Like how later on he could take that one line, and I always knew what character was speaking because no other character did that kind of thing. And I guess that's kind of the goal with all things. He did it really well in parts of that book, and I think that's something that authors need to aspire to do as well, is to build dialogue. And you know, you've probably heard many times, build dialogue where if you took all the dialogue takes out, you'd still know who was speaking. But it's really hard to do because if you know, depending on your world, if you don't have a bunch of different dialects or cultures and everyone's speaking just plain English, which a lot of people do in conversations, you know, what can you do without like repeating the same thing over and over and over and over again to make that come to life? So that was really interesting. All right, I'm a little over my time. Sorry about that. Hope you enjoyed the episode. I will be back in another month to talk about what I learned in the last month. Hopefully a month's time, I'll be heavily into book number 2 and having gotten back some feedback on book number 1.